Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeff Michaels, and I'm the IEN Senior Fellow at eBay. I'd like to welcome all of you to eBay's seminar series on U.S. foreign policy. The series is part of a joint initiative of eBay and the Barcelona Institute of North American Studies that aims to promote discussion of U.S. foreign policy related topics by inviting both scholars and practitioners to share their research and provide their insights. This evening, we will be focusing on a subject that over the last couple of decades in particular, has become a much higher priority in terms of U.S. relationships with other countries, and that is the U.S. relationship with India. It's a relationship that, going back to India's independence in 1947, has had its ups and downs. It's a very complicated relationship, and when I say complicated, just going back to February of 2020, with Trump's visit to India, I sometimes think this was a case of the best of times simultaneously being the worst of times as well. In the words of tonight's speaker, India is not an ally. Instead, the U.S.-India relationship represents, quote, an abiding partnership unlike any other. Now, given the purpose of this seminar, especially when it comes to trying to understand the future of U.S. foreign policy, and especially the emerging foreign policy of the Biden administration, I thought this would be a good topic to have a discussion about, not for the least of reasons that the U.S.-India relationship never seems to be just about the U.S. and India. One almost always has to mention a third or fourth country, whether that is Pakistan or China, and now increasingly Japan and Australia. So if I could put it in very crude terms, for the price of a discussion about the U.S. and India, one also gains important local and regional insights as well. Tonight's talk is also somewhat timely given that the U.S. Defense Secretary visited India a few weeks ago. So to enlighten us on these topics, it gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce a very old friend of mine, Rudra Chaudhuri. By way of introduction, I should be absolutely forthright and say that one of the reasons why I asked Rudra to speak with us is that if anyone is plugged into the sort of networks of high-level policymakers that actually know what's going on behind the scenes, stop nodding your head, Rudy. It's true. It is Rudra. In addition to being a brilliant scholar, and I'll come back to that in a moment, Rudra also combines all the attributes of a diplomat, walking encyclopedia of anything to do with U.S.-India relations, India-China relations, India-Pakistan, the Taliban, and so forth. And on top of all that, more recently, after founding and heading the India Institute at King's College London, a couple of years ago, he took up the post of director of Carnegie India. So I guess you wear a managerial hat as well. But in terms of his scholarship, Rudra focuses on both the present as well as the past. A particular note is his 2014 book, Forged in Crisis, India and the United States since 1947, published by Oxford University Press and Hearst. In addition, he's published articles with the International History Review, Diplomacy and Statecraft, the Journal of Strategic Studies, International Affairs, the Rusi Journal, among many others. Before I turn over to Rudra, I just mentioned to our participants that if you have any questions, and Rudra has mentioned to me before that he'd very much like this to be more of a conversation rather than a lecture format, I would just ask you to enter them into the chat box. To find it, you go down to the lower right-hand side of the screen where you'll see a pinkish purplish box. If you click on that, it will open up, and then you'll see the icon on the lower left-hand side. You can enter any questions you have into that box. I would ask if you do have any questions to also please identify your name and any affiliation. So Rudra, welcome to Barcelona, virtually at least. It's wonderful to see you, and I very much look forward to your presentation. So the floor is all yours.
Jeff, thanks so much. Firstly, thanks to the Institute for having me. Second, Jeff, thanks so much for the overly kind and a bit too generous an introduction, I must say. I wish I was a quarter of the kind of things that Jeff's just outlined for you. I'm not. And just one factual thing, I wasn't the founder of the India Institute at King's. It had a much grander and a kind of a true scholar who set it up, but it was a pleasure to work at King's. Jeff's been an old friend, and we've often debated and argued about a whole range of issues in world politics. regional politics, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's the US and India. And I should just say is that it is perhaps one of the best sets of conversations that I've ever had, and I've learned so much through those. And I hope very much that this seminar gives me an opportunity to continue my friendship with Jeff, I should say, and perhaps with the Institute as well. So it's a small group of people, so I think it'll make sense to keep this as interactive as possible. So what I'll try and do is just kind of speak for about 20-25 minutes. And I thought I'd divide the kind of talk into three kind of broad and simple parts. So one, talk a little bit about where the US and India might be perceived to be at this time in the 21st century in 2021 with the new administration in the United States. Proceed to try and unpack how did we get here. So go back to history for a little while before we come back to some of the challenges and perhaps the opportunities, which is kind of a little bit more of a kind of a policy shop unpacking in the last bit. And I'll try and literally keep it to 20 minutes because I think on webinars, I think that's just good timing. As Jeff said, when you're talking about the US and India, in many ways it's talking about, at least as far as India is concerned, the relationship is something of a barometer of the way in which India also thinks of the world. So you could almost draw a kind of a wiggly line, kind of a time-tested line over US-India relations and kind of juxtapose that against India's approach to foreign policy, its outreach to the world, its opening up, and a variety of other things. So it is that kind of major barometer, major relationship that shapes not just the way India thinks about a massive and yet another outsized democracy, but also the way in which it just thinks about life, thinks about the world, thinks about international affairs, the Indo-Pacific, economics, finance, digital trade, data, and a whole range of other issues. And that's just worth keeping in mind. There is no other relationship for a country like India which does exactly the same. So where are we today? I mean, literally today, we're at the cusp of a almost complete transformation in US-India relations compared to where perhaps the bilateral relationship was in the 1950s or 1960s. I mean, that's without doubt. It's almost cliche to even say it. But it's just worth keeping in mind is that this transformation, this kind of almost, this change, while it's been in the works for about 50 or 60 years, it accelerated in a period of about 10 to 15 years. And that's what's really interesting about the US-India relationship. Back in 2005, US-India defense ties and defense trade was at $0 billion. So there was $0 billion of trade between the two countries when it came to defense equipment. Today, it's at about $20 billion, right? India is one of the larger markets when it comes to US kit, Air Force, when it comes to platforms, when it comes to drones, and a whole range of other issues. If you think about trade relations today, the United States is India's second largest trade partner when it comes to goods, only recently surpassed by China, which is also interesting. And perhaps we can take a few questions on that, just at a time in which the Indian-Chinese relationship is really kind of at the downer, looking to kind of rescue itself. Interesting, the trade relationship, at least as far as goods is concerned, is on the way up. So by and large, I mean, the US-India finds itself today in a pretty substantive space, especially in the defense and the strategic realm. That's almost kind of become a silver lining to the relationship. So if trade talks falter, if there's a problem between the USTR, the trade representatives in Washington, and their counterparts in India in trade and commerce, and if they're finding it difficult to figure out how do we find common standards on poultry or agriculture, or where the American pharmaceutical industry says that it needs a lot more access to India's pharma market, to price checks on stents, etc. Whenever all those problems happen, it's almost like those are kind of placed in a box. And so far, they haven't spilled into the strategic or the defense definition of the relationship. That's not just defined by India importing American kit. I think a lot of that is also centered by the fact that today, both countries see a major strategic challenge in Asia and to world politics in general. And it is that challenge, for instance, that shapes the way in which both these countries come together on a whole range of issues. It's not smooth. As Jeff said, it's complicated. After all, these are two oversized democracies, the oldest and the youngest in many respects, and the largest, sorry. So they're bound to be complications and issues. But by and large, it is these strategic challenges of our time that seems to shape the kind of the barometer in the bilateral relationship. So how did we get here? How did we get to this place where there's this comfort level, where there's the strategic understanding, for instance, which, by the way, is quite a change. I mean, I remember 15 years ago when I was just starting out with stuff and life, using terms like partners, alliances, making a case for greater military interoperability, say between the United States and India, would be very difficult, would be a set of arguments that would be not necessarily impossible to advocate, but very difficult to advocate, right? For a range of reasons, for historical reasons, political reasons, and otherwise. Today, it's part of the course. India and the US, under Trump, signed the last of what's called the foundational agreements, by which these are agreements that connect both countries on logistics, communications. India today can get geospatial intelligence from the United States, which it used to good effect from what we can make out in open source during its troubles with China in last summer in 2020, when there was a kind of a fallout on the border, which led to fatalities. And these kinds of interoperability issues kind of, they started about 20 years ago. But now they're complete. So you have a full, compact, complete package between the US and India when it comes to defense ties. And that's actually quite a change. Now, in thinking about this particular moment of a transformed relationship, it's worth kind of going back to sort of the 40s and the 50s for about 10 minutes to try and get a sense of how did we get here. The conventional argument, at least in the literature, when it comes to US-India relations has largely been that this is an estranged relationship. And that was the term used by the American diplomat Dennis Cox, the scholar, who said is that, look, this is an estranged relationship. Many have said that actually the first 50 years, so the period from 1947 when India became independent, all the way till the early 90s in the post-Cold War period, that this was the kind of lost half decade of US-India relations. So there's just been this assumption that it's only in the post-Cold War period, to use the title of an excellent book written by a very senior scholar, is when India crossed the Rubicon on a range of issues, including its relations with India, with the United States. But actually, history is testimony to something quite different. This is not to kind of plug a very old book that I've written now, but 6 or 7 years old. But genuinely, this relationship kind of moved inch by inch, and there was this kind of sense of understanding, this kind of almost membrane-like understanding between the two sides. Right. So I'm just saying is that this understanding didn't just develop in the post-Cold War period, right, where there was a structural change to international politics, which as the argument goes, prompted India and the United States to come together or start dealing with each other more proactively. In the early 1950s, and this is quite interesting, India became independent in 47. So you would think that the one country that would remain connected to India, that would be able to shape Indian policies for much of the 50s or 60s, would actually be Britain, right? India bought most of its defense kit, or naval kit, its first aircraft carrier, from Great Britain through the 1950s. But quite interestingly, by the end of the Korean War, by 1953, I think a reasonable argument could be made that it was the United States that was the #1 actor when it came to South Asia, and it was certainly the #1 actor when it came to India's kind of diplomatic reach in the Western world. India, of course, had another reach in the Eastern world with the Soviet Union, which is a whole different story. So in some sense, it is decade after decade that this relationship generally gets forged in crises. And crises such as war. In 1962, India fought a war with China. The long and short of it is India lost territory, China gained territory. But the United States played an instructive role. It played a critical role in offering aid, in providing assistance, in providing military assistance. In 1965, India fought a war with Pakistan. I think that war is best described as a war that India won, perhaps by not losing. There's no better way to characterize it. The United States played a very different role, a slightly more detached role. But there was a sense of understanding within India of what the US and then the Johnson administration was willing to do. How far was it willing to go? Was it willing to utilize its own bilateral ties with India to de-escalate tensions in South Asia? Or the fact that, in 1965 was a good example where the Americans basically said, hey, listen, we've had enough with South Asia. Why doesn't the UN deal with this? So in each of these episodes, you see a very different set of ties that kind of come together and a greater understanding between these two democracies. And the understanding is not only at the principles level, it's not only between the White House and the Prime Minister's office, the State Department and the Indian Ministry of External Affairs. The Afghanistan takes place between people. It takes place between scientists, between those who are working together in agriculture. The United States played a critical role in the Green Revolution in India, in nuclear politics and civil nuclear energy agreements. So over the decades, there's this multi-layered kind of democratic vibe between these two countries that kind of grows decade and decade. And sometimes they get it wrong. In 1971, there was a serious downturn in the relationship between Nixon in America and Prime Minister Indira Gandhi in India, where they just couldn't see eye to eye on a particular situation in then East Pakistan, which then became the youngest South Asian state, Bangladesh, at the end of 1971, when the Indian military intervened. They were on opposite sides. But what's interesting is, though, although both these countries were on opposite sides of that East Pakistani divide, by early 1970s, by 72, it was none other than Henry Kissinger who would turn around to the Indian ambassador in Washington and says that, look, we bet on the wrong horse, right? There's a lot more going on in this relationship. We can't let this episode derail the way we think about life together. So what you see is that the strategic transformation that kind of comes together with the foundational agreements and defense ties in the better half of the 21st century, that reasoning starts to gain momentum as early as the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. And the fact that India, for the United States, has remained a large consumer economy, a market economy, it's a fact that has not been lost at any point in time in any of these crises. But in the 90s is when you see a real structural shift, because the nature of international politics changes. And what takes place in India is a massive reset. So this is not just about the United States. It's a government in India. It was then a Congress-led government, a minority government in India, which decided is that, look, it's post-Cold War. We're in a balance of payments crises. We're going to be absolutely broke unless we just change the way in which we perform and the way in which we do business and the way in which we do trade and economics. It led to what might be called a strategic reset in the way India thought about international life. And it led to essentially what's called first generation economic reforms. It liberalized India, opened up India. American companies and Western companies could now come to India with greater security, that their investments were more secure. And it prompted a serious rethinking of Indian foreign policy. On the one side to the east, towards the ASEAN countries, on the other side to the United States, and hence began in a functional way a renewed US-India bilateral diplomatic track that was strengthened because of the post-Cold War period and India's realization of what it needed to do to get on. But it was also substantiated by this long history of crises and this kind of understanding that had taken place between scientists and the Congress and the Indian Parliament and others. So there was this kind of foundation which had never been really defined, which was then kind of monopolized in the 90s and literally led to a complete change in relations. It was a period, ironically, between 1998 and 2008, right? A decade where these forces of transformation were given a political voice in both countries. And they were given politicians in both countries or bureaucrats to actually come together, sit down in back channels, sit down across tables and thrash out the issues of the future. And what's interesting is that a lot of this took place on the back of India's nuclear tests in 1998. So you would think, and if you were someone in the Clinton White House in 1998 and India just tested nuclear weapons, and Clinton represented the best of the Democrats when it came to straitjacket non-proliferation, you would think that that would actually lead to a severe break in US-India ties. Ironically, it transformed it kind of gave an engine or an impulse to that transformation. Ironically, it actually got both countries to get up and say that, well, actually, we need to talk about the world. And it gave the Americans the opportunity to think and say that, well, fact is, India is nuclear. We need to deal with this. We need to think about stability in South Asia. We need to think about economics. We need to think about trade. We need to think about the fact that sanctioning India is not going to be very wise, given our own companies need to invest in India. And that realization came towards the end of the Clinton tenure and with the onset of the Bush administration. And that period from 2001 to 2008 is actually remarkable. It's about things that you'd never think of in India, of diplomats sitting at airports with their counterparts in America and talking about nuclear relations. talking about the Middle East, talking about non-proliferation, meetings taking place in third countries on the sidelines, a quiet back channel where essentially both sides are trying to gauge of what would be the contours that would work for each other in kind of reforming this relationship. A lot of that job was done by 2008, primarily with the conclusion of something that came to be called the US-India nuclear deal. That was a major agreement. It's a diplomatic agreement between the two countries. It's a scientific agreement, and beyond everything else, it's a nuclear agreement. I won't go into too many details, and we can go into questions. But essentially, what it did is the Bush administration turned around and said, "Listen, India tested a nuclear bomb. Yes, number one. Two, India is a country that in the 60s did not sign up to what's called the nuclear non-proliferation regime, right? And by the rules of the NPT, for any country that has tested a bomb prior to the 1st of January 1967 would be generally considered what's called a nuclear weapons state. India was not. It stayed out of the treaty. It built fissile material. It produced fissile material. It tested a bomb first in 1974, then again in 1988. But Bush basically and his advisors, people like Condoleezza Rice and a range of people who I'm privileged to work with now at the Carnegie Endowment, turned around and said, listen, we have to think of the strategic rationale that drives this relationship. They were talking about China. They were talking about a changed Asia. And they said, we have to get around this nuclear blockchain debacle between the two sides, right? And that's exactly what Bush did. And he maneuvered this agreement that was not just between the US and India, but he maneuvered an agreement by which India today stands as the only country in the world that stands outside the NPT regime, can continue to produce fissile material and engage in limited civil nuclear ties with 45 members of the nuclear suppliers group. No other country can do that. And that led to that was a convincer, if you like, to many of the naysayers in the relationship, people who said, look, it's going to be difficult to actually get these two sides to put political capital into something as big as this. And that kind of served as a strategic convincer. And in some respects, it's that convincing process that has kind of provided that fixed deposit, a mutual fund, or that kind of financial investment strategic kind of vertical, which both countries are kind of working off even today. So that's just kind of a quick kind of on history itself. So where are we right now? And I'll kind of end in the next sort of 2 minutes. So number one, as I said in the introduction, you're at this kind of fairly transformed place when it comes to US-India ties, especially with regards to defense, is thinking about a strategic rationale for a strengthening tie. Some of it is around China. A lot of it is around China. Some of it is around the needs to work together for technology. Some of it is market reality. There's a view in India. India is all about scale. It has more data than anyone else in the world, in the open world. The United States has capital. Japan has capital. So all of these kind of factors help shape this kind of crucial relationship. But now you're moving to a place where both these countries have turned around and said is that, look, it's not just about us and the way we may be able to shape parts of the world, or at least do more by way of our bilateral defense ties. But let's start working with minilateral arrangements like the Quad, for instance. So that's Australia, Japan, the United States, and India. These four countries have got together as this kind of quadrilateral dialogue, which today has kind of, some argue that this is the beginning of a new alliance system. I generally don't think so, but it does provide a platform by which four countries can test out military interoperability. They do naval exercises together. They have a better understanding of where each other are when it comes to military realities. But Quads increasingly become what might be called a marketplace. So while driven in many respects by the vision of Shinzo Abe in Japan, supported today in a more forthright way by Australia, it's really this oldest democracy in the world, America, the largest democracy in the world, that India, that in my view gives the Quad meaning which it just wouldn't have without these two countries. It would be impossible, right? It's about market size, it's about demography, and it's just about geography, right? And in some respects, what you're beginning to see with the Quad is that the kind of conversations that Indian leaders had perhaps in the late 90s, early 2000s with their US counterparts, being transformed into this more minilateral body, where today you're talking about supply chains. You're talking about a common market when it comes to technology, on semiconductors. And my sense is in the next decade, It is this Quad process that will transform not only the way in which multilateralism works, not only the future of the Indo-Pacific, which is very much the focus of the Quad countries, but also in many different respects, the contours of the US-India relationship. What are the challenges? And I'll just quickly end here. There are certain bilateral challenges. Things are certainly not all hunky-dory between the two sides. Largely, India survived the Trump era. In a sense, I would say the Indian leadership gamed the Trump administration. It gave Trump finances in exchange for defense, and that kept the Trump administration more or less satiated and kept the relationship going. Not so good on the trade and commercial bits, and I can go into kind of questions around that. There are key differences when it comes to technology, when it comes to emerging technologies, the adoption and the use of artificial intelligence, blockchain, quantum computing, cloud computing. And these are kind of new areas of interest for me, and I'm happy to discuss this in more detail. But some of those differences are significant. They're not just differences because of markets. They're also differences because of values. They're also differences because India is in a country that is in an economically not in a very enviable position. So that the difference today about semiconductors and tech is in a sense similar to the difference that, say, the US and Japan would have in the 1980s with regards to computing, right? But Japan had turned out to be protectionist, the US pushed it, and Japan kind of opened its market up. The difference is the US, Japan are formal, traditional treaty allies. The US and India are not. And that takes me to the last point. Jeff began by saying is that, I've often made this position that US and India will never be an alliance, but it'll be an abiding partnership. And that is the part, I think, over the next decade that needs to be better understood, perhaps more by the United States than in India, where the expectation is that when you get these arrangements, you've got a Quad, you've got better bilateral ties, you start moving towards something of an alliance structure, even if you don't want to call it an alliance. But I don't think that's going to be the case. And I think the nuance between a partnership or a strategic partnership and an alliance is where perhaps on the bilateral level, you will see a delta of differences between sides. But I'm going to stop here, and then perhaps, Jeff, if you'd like to open up to questions or however you'd like to do it.
Sure. Well, thank you, Rudra, so much for that presentation. I mean, you've covered a great deal of ground. I'm going to take some questions from the participants in a minute, but I just would like to ask you, just sort of following up on something that you mentioned. I mean, like as with any sort of bilateral relationship, even the best of them, as you and I both know, with the US-UK relationship, for example, there are sort of good bits and bad bits. It's certainly not a perfect relationship in any way, shape, or form. I am curious, though, with respect to India and Indian views of the relationship with the United States. I mean, from an American perspective, or even you might even say from an IR theory perspective, certainly a realist perspective at any rate, there should be a very, very close relationship. On the other hand, I would have assumed that at least from India's perspective, they don't want to get close without being too close. That there's this issue of traditionally voices saying, don't get too close, stay away. We don't want to be under the, we don't want to be following the US. We want to be perhaps alongside the US, but not following the US. And of course, the US has a rather nasty habit of always wanting to be in the forefront, or in a sense, be in the dominant position. So I'm just sort of curious from the Indian perspective, quote unquote, what are the voices of restraint? What do they say? What are the voices of hesitation?
No, Jeff, thanks for that. And let me answer it in this way. Look, every country, no matter if you're in an alliance structure, unilateral, multilateral, bilateral, you design your alliance structures and your partnerships based on your ability to have freedom of movement. So even within an alliance, you try as hard as possible to create that freedom of movement, right? That's what defines politics in bilateral relations, right? Or multilateral relations. Think of ANZUS, think of the special relationship the UK and the US, the Suez crises, and a whole range of examples, right? Most people say is that, some would argue that India is no different. India is a country that is trying to, maintain as much freedom of maneuver as possible. It's trying to strive for as much strategic autonomy as possible. The current Indian External Affairs Minister has written a dazzlingly amazing book just on the question of autonomy. So there are two parts to your question. The first is what drives that autonomy. as I said, many argue that every country drives autonomy, but I think with India, there is something that's different. There is a premium provided to autonomy or independence that, however you cut it, comes from history, right? I'm not saying it comes from colonial history. I think that argument is binary reductionist and just too simplistic. But there is something to be said about the DNA of Indian leadership that has wanted to keep autonomy in a particular way, right? Which is very different to, say, Pakistan or the United Kingdom, or certainly developed countries of Western Europe. And we can get into that if you want. But there is a normative structure for that independence. Now, how does that independence work out with America, and where does it create trouble today? Lloyd Austin, as you correctly said, was recently in India. And while, of course, it was great, early in the Biden administration, you had your Secretary of Defense who came down. John Kerry's been in town the last couple of days talking about climate stuff. But it's interesting, when Austin was here, most newspaper headlines focused on the bilateral relationship, but then focused more on India's potential import of the S-400 anti-aircraft system from Russia, right? And that really brought home in a clear way the kind of independence and autonomy that India seeks. And within the NATO, the only other country that would seek this is perhaps Turkey, right? To have that kind of freedom of maneuver. And I think that is what people in America are confounded by. To say is that, look, we've got this strong partnership, we've got this economic relationship. In American view, or the view of congressmen and women who've been supporting this relationship, or my own colleagues and friends in DC who've been supporting the relationship, their basic view is, look, what more could you essentially want? Our limitations aren't very strong. We're not saying don't deal with the world or vote on Iran the way we vote on Iran. But their view basically is to say is that, look, you just can't buy Russian kit. You can't buy strategic kit, which will make it more difficult for you to import the kind of American kit that we want to give you in a generation of network-centric warfare. But I think that's where this independence kicks in. And where India says that, well, actually, we're going to buy the S-400, and actually, we're going to maneuver this relationship whereby we're going to remain as strong with you as we've been in the past. And that's the delta. That's the difference.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. And actually, sort of just reminded me about a decade ago when we were talking about, I think, fighter jets and whether it would be British BAE or the French or maybe the Swedes, even if I remember correctly. But there were quite a few that were being discussed at that time. Anyway, I'd like to turn to a question from Laura Klosek. She says, thanks a lot for the very interesting talk. My question is regarding the considerable Indian diaspora in the United States and how important you see their role in shaping US-India relations. I remember an article in which their role in regard to the India-US nuclear deal was discussed. So I was wondering how strong you see their influence.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Laura. That's a great question. I should just, from the outset, say is that, look, you just have to read everything written by my colleague, Milind Vaishnav in Carnegie, DC. I mean, he's just fantastic, and he's done some amazing survey-based work on the Indian diaspora, especially close to the elections, and that's really worth the kind of read. It's all available on the Carnegie website. The Indian diaspora makes about 1% of the US population. It's been largely, it's been a large supporter of democratic politics within the United States, although now there's evidence of kind of a Republican move. Trump was super aware of the diaspora. I mean, one of the reasons he did this whole Howdy Modi thing in Houston, where he went to a stadium, was to basically win over that diaspora and use the Indian Prime Minister almost as an agent or a message to that kind of population to say is that, hey, vote Trump. We didn't see much of that actually, according to Millen's own surveys and YouGov surveys. But here's the thing about diaspora. It plays an instrumental role for sure, especially when it comes to the economic relationship. And as you mentioned, the US-India nuclear deal was really a period in which the diaspora was fired up. It was activated both from New Delhi as well as from Washington. There are key individuals in that diaspora who served as a bridge when there was difference, when the US Congress basically turned around and said, listen, why the hell should we give India this amazing US deal with no guarantees? We get nothing, right? And actually, when the deal was signed, India signed its first nuclear agreement with Russia, right? So a lot of these US congressmen turn around and congresswomen turn around and said, why are we helping India? And it is that diaspora that played an important role. The US-India Business Council is important. It's an economic body where the diaspora again plays a very important role in the tech sector, the connection between Silicon Valley and Bengaluru or Hyderabad or Pune, the tech centers of India. There's a very nice kind of netizen connect there. But here's the thing about the diaspora, it's still a far cry from, say, the organized way in which the Israeli diaspora works inside the United States, right? The Indian diaspora is, to use a tech term, it's blockchain. It's completely decentralized, right? There are different pockets. There's no political formation that puts it together. And that might not actually be a bad thing. It's worth keeping in mind. I mean, and I'm sure you've got this in your reading somewhere, but there's this great book by Walter Bersheimer on the Israeli diaspora, right? And their basic argument is that, look, diasporas, as they strengthen decade by decade on policy issues, they get to a place by which they make it very difficult for the host government to actually practice a different set of policies, right? Because they're in DC, they're in New York, they're on Wall Street, they're in Silicon Valley. And then you've got a population in Tel Aviv trying to shape policy, for instance. So diasporas decade by decade get entrenched. They also get more conservative. They remember the country that they left, not the country that they now visit, right? So my own sense is that actually keeping the Indian diaspora decentralized and disorganized is net beneficial for India when it comes to its own freedom of maneuver using foreign policy. But but the short answer is they're important. They play an important role in business, not necessarily in other aspects of social policy or the Quad or other military issues, but certainly on the kind of business to business ties.
Thank you very much for that, Rudra. I'm going to turn now to a question from Shashwat Kumar, who works here at the Institute. He asks if strategic relations, especially China, is what is driving US-India relations despite differences over trade relations, then does that mean that strategic relationships are the cornerstone of India's foreign policy? And, excuse me, and using this logic, EU-India relations will be more bumpy because there is no strategic angle to it, and trade differences would be similar to what we see exist between the US and India.
Yeah, thanks, Shashwat. That's a really good question. So I'm going to answer this in two parts. I'm going to talk about US, India, and China first, and then I'm going to talk about the EU, India. And again, on this, and it's not that I'm just kind of putting this back to you, but the book you got to read is by my friend and the senior colleague Tanvi Madan at Brookings in DC, called The Fateful Triangle. The entire book is about this US, China, India triangle from a historical perspective. So here's the thing. There's a general sense on key constituencies in both Washington as well as in New Delhi that China stands as a central challenge. It provides the basis for a stronger strategic and defense relationship between India, US, within the Quad countries and otherwise. However, here's where it can get muddy and problematic, is the US and India were, to a certain extent, on the same page when it came to China towards the latter part of the Trump administration, right? So the fact that you had a Trump administration and a Secretary of State, Pompeo, who went around basically saying is that we're going to develop an obstructionist policy towards China. So it's coercion by obstruction. We decouple, we don't work with China, we don't want you to work with China, right? That was very much the message. India had a border issue with China, which is a massive contested boundary, 3,488 kilometers. That's not going away. That's almost unlike any other dynamic that China has with other countries today. It's a bit like the Soviet Union and China in the 1970s, for instance, and their border disputes. India had a border problem with China. People died on the border. There were fatalities. And India basically jumped onto the Pompeo bandwagon and said is that, look, if you're not going to fix our border issues and if you're not going to back off on the border, we're going to press you really hard on the strategic front, technology front, investment front, obstruct, make it difficult for you to invest. Now things have changed. The border's got a bit better. There's a degree of de-escalation, disengagement of troops. Things are calming down on the border. India saying is that, okay, let's now think of revising the relationship. What's the point I'm making is that it's okay to have China as a rationale to build a strategic relationship, but it's worth keeping in mind that both India and the US will have very different ways in which it deals with China. Today, you've got an administration in the US that I believe at any time will deal with China via engagement. It'll be, if Trump was about coercion via obstructionism, this will be coercion via engagement. This is détente. And notwithstanding the harsh words used in Alaska and other such places, I think this is essentially where we'll end up, right? For India, the key focus is, beyond everything else, it's a continental issue. people talk a lot about the Indo-Pacific and maritime issues. It's worth keeping in mind that India's key security questions are continental. It's land boundaries, it's large armies, it's large investments, it's artillery, it's armored cores sitting on that boundary, right? So if that relationship stabilizes, my own sense is it will, to a certain extent, change the way in which the India-China kind of relationship kind of works. But these are two different mechanics, right? You're not going to find common meaning in them. There's an overarching common understanding that China is a challenge. To use Boris Johnson's term, it's a systematic foe, right? But there will be a difficulty if you benchmark your strategic relationship only on China. If you benchmark the Quad only on China, it will make it very difficult for 2 countries or 4 countries to work together down the line. Scott Morrison hates China, I think it's fair to say. An Australian Prime Minister 6 or 7 years ago did not. That had a very different effect to the way in which Australia even read the Quad, right? And those political dynamics will change. On your last point is on the EU. I actually see the EU as slightly different. I'm not sure every relationship requires a large strategic rationale. And the EU-India one is, there is a strategic rationale. It's about a middle path. It's about finding a place and finding a secure geography, jurisdiction, and place for trade diplomacy outside of the US, outside of China, in many ways, right? And I think and I would say it's where the Indian government today plays a lot of emphasis is on the EU, is on Europe, which includes UK, although the EU does it. But the UK, Europe is of strategic significance to the government. That's where you're going to see a lot of high-tech transfers. That's where you're going to see manufacturing transfers. That's where you're going to see new standards be created in the new economy, for instance. And you're right, there are trade issues. The US and the EU and India have not managed to find common ground in a free trade agreement for a very long time, over 6 or 7 key issues: the price of wine, labor standards, and a range of other things. But my own sense is that that won't necessarily be a deterrent for strengthening EU-India relations. And I think they'll be careful. They're going to keep the China card out. The EU structurally cannot speak about China in one voice. You have 26, 27 countries. Many of them have mortgaged futures to the Belt and Road Initiative, especially in Southern Europe, for instance, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and a range of other countries. It's just going to be very difficult for the EU to figure out a common approach to China. And I think India gets that. And I think they'll be very careful. And India wouldn't want it either. India doesn't want alliances necessarily against China, but they want a balance when and if China becomes belligerent, just as it is right now on India's borders. But if I could ask a question to Jeff, and I'd be interested, I don't know how this works, but I'd be really interested to see what Jeff's own views are on US-China relations. I mean, you really have one of the key experts sitting right here, and how you see that kind of unfolding in the near future.
Yes, well, you're definitely putting me on the spot there. What I'll sort of put it in very blunt terms, and it's something, it's a sort of phenomenon that I've also noticed with respect to NATO and China more generally, for example, so not just the US and China, which is that once the US, and I think NATO more generally, but certainly the US, begins to get focused on an issue, everybody starts jumping on the bandwagon. And that's an extremely dangerous phenomenon, because in a sense you have to inflate the threat to justify all the attention that's being paid to it. So that is one aspect that I'm especially worried about. Now, with respect to China, what I find interesting as well is I'm, again, old enough to remember back in the late 1990s when China was going to be the next big priority for US foreign policy. 9/11 happens, and then of course at that point in time, India is placed on the back burner. Fast forward to 2010, 2011, Obama, the Asia pivot. China is now increasing in importance again as Afghanistan is slowly on the decline. But then of course you have 2014 with Russia and the Crimea, you have the rise of ISIS, and so on. And then China's put on the back burner again until I think late 2017, early 2018, when the Trump administration issues its national security strategy, then the US defense strategy in 2018. And it's been increasing in pace ever since. Now, whether anything can actually distract it at this point in time, whether Russia does something in Ukraine again, that sort of distraction we'll see. But frankly, it seems to be they keep coming back to China no matter what the distraction is. So in that sense, I don't see it going anywhere. I don't see it going in a positive direction anytime soon at all. The current trend is extremely negative in the sense that there's sort of no constructive future. There's no constructive end game that anybody's really talking about in a serious way. And I think that's extremely dangerous. It's certainly not something that I'm looking forward to seeing how that evolves over the next few years, but I regret to say that that seems to be almost inevitable. Perhaps it's not, it may be justified, but it's certainly negative nevertheless. Rudra, I just want to sort of ask you, and this partially has to do with the question that you've asked me, which is, I'm sort of curious, going back to, you mentioned Kissinger, for example. Not Kissinger in China in this case, but actually when I'm thinking about Kissinger and Indira Gandhi, and Nixon and Indira Gandhi as well. The extent to which these personalities actually matter. Now, not asking you to go all the way back to Indira Gandhi or even earlier than that, with Nehru, for example, but more recently when you think about Obama or Trump or now with Blinken, Biden, how important are these relationships at that level?
If I have to think of in any country or between any countries, if I have to think of what is it that drives relationships, for me, it would be Churchill's, and excuse the kind of gender exclusivity here, but it would be kind of Churchill's great man theory, right? Or great man or great woman theory, that people actually matter, personalities matter. Two, for instance, I think it would be values. I think each administration carries a set of values to a large extent. We may disagree, but in his destructive way, Trump also represented a set of values, which were obviously quite potent in the ballot when Biden went to the polls. And three, to a certain extent, in classic IR sense, is of course structure and the system and the nature of politics as we see it, right? So I think that's how I would weight the role of personalities. When it comes to the US and India, they're tremendously important. The vibe that Indian leaders have been able to have with their counterparts. If I think about Reagan and Indira Gandhi, for instance, right, compared to, say, Reagan and Nixon. If I think about, say, Nehru and Eisenhower compared to Nehru and Kennedy, where in the latter case, there was a much stronger understanding between the two sides, where key personalities, Jackie Kennedy actually played a very important role in explaining to someone like Jack Kennedy that even at a time when India is down in 1962, it's worth giving India all the military assistance it needs, primarily because it is a democracy, without asking for an alliance and without expecting an alliance. So personalities play an important role. There are many such messengers in the US-India kind of relationship, many in the business community today. Biden, he's been somebody who is championed the India cause. He's done it on the Hill in the United States. He's done it as the vice president. I, although, would be very interested to see, and he's kind of championed the India cause when it comes to the interim national security strategy, in all the messaging from Anthony Blinken to Lloyd Austin. There's a very clear sense that India strategically matters. It matters not just because of the changing dynamics in the Indo-Pacific or the Quad or the need to work with India in tech and business, etc., but because these are two large kind of democracies. But I think the challenge will come in the way in which these two democracies deal with international challenges. Climate is one of them. The future of the G20 is another. Standards around data, for instance, could very well become a major dividing line between the United States and India, unless there's a proactive investment in that part of that relationship, which I don't see as yet. I think people kind of take it for granted. Their view seems to be, a lot of my American colleagues argue that, the problem with India is that it's protectionist. But that's not just the problem. The problem is India's evolving a sophisticated data architecture, which if you don't work with in the moment, in 6 or 8 months from now, will look very different to what you ideally want India to be. as far as say data relations are concerned or the future of AI is concerned. And I think these issues are the ones which are going to be the challenge. And there again, it's personalities that will matter to a large extent. If I look at the Biden administration, I'd be actually hard pressed to find those personalities today, right? I mean, apart from the Secretary of State, apart from the National Security Advisor, who are well versed with India, who understand India better than most, certainly better than I. But they're not the ones that you need to go out on the limb when it comes to matters of bureaucracy. I don't see those India specialists in the bureaucracy, in the NSC, in the State Department as yet, which are willing to, where you need those personality ties. But I'm sure you will, but personalities, they have mattered. And here's the one about Trump, and I'll end here on this question is, I think the Indians did an amazing job of decoding that personality. I think they figured it out with Trump. And I remember when before Prime Minister Modi's first trip to the US after Trump became president, there was a huge amount of worry, concern, even among those in the journalist crowd or those practitioners. I think there was a huge amount of anxiety in terms of how is that meeting actually going to go down. And I think the Indians just basically figured out that that transactionalism is not just some kind of a cliche. You got to use it. If you want something out of America under this president, you got to give something to America that matters for you. And what mattered for you was defense kit, right? And that was the primary kind of silver lining that drove that relationship for 4 years, when, to be honest, it could have gone completely awry. And I think the Indians also exercised an amazing amount of strategic patience. When the Americans hit the world with economic tariffs on iron and other things in the beginning, the Indians didn't retaliate because they figured out if you retaliate with Trump and if you push him too hard, he'll come at you and it'll unnecessarily break a chain in that relationship.
Rudra, two more questions just to end our session. I'll get to Shashwat's in just a second, but I just want to follow up on one thing with this issue of working relationships for a second, because I noticed the other day that there was some sort of incident involving the 7th Fleet, some sort of freedom of navigation operation. And the reason I mention that is because I think there's sort of a history of the U.S. putting its foot in its mouth, if I could put it like that, an obvious own goal that shouldn't have happened if, with these sort of bigger strategic relations in mind, but for some reason the U.S. sort of keeps doing this. I was sort of just curious about your reaction to that.
Look, I think, I can't say this is a teething issue between the two sides. These issues will happen. The US Navy has its own protocols. It has its own way in which it does its business. The long and short of it is this: India has a particular view of what it considers to be its own economic zones in the maritime domain, right, in the commons. That view is not shared by the United States or the US Navy. The US Navy argues that in its defense, it argues that India's position is not consistent with UNCLOS, right? With the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas. Now that's ironic because we're not quite sure what the United States' position is when it comes to UNCLOS, right? So I'm not sure that defense holds. What was surprising to many was that in this age where you've got US principals coming to India one after the other, you've got Austin at the tail end of a major visit to Northeast Asia, you've got John Kerry coming to India, basically said, look, I need support when it comes to my climate change. I can't do it without India. I can't do it without China, right? So I need you guys. And India's actually done well when it comes to the COP25, its own obligations, the upcoming COP26 between the UK and Italy, et cetera, et cetera. So then suddenly out of the blue, you've got this statement, very small, from the US Navy saying is that it challenges India's position on these kind of boundary issues in the maritime domain. So there are, Indian editorials are baying for blood. They want an explanation. They want the Indian government to make clear its own explanation. My own sense is at the diplomatic level, it's been, views have been exchanged. There will be some kind of a dialogue, and hopefully not much of this will happen in the future. But I think there's a genuine question of, on a completely tactical issue, what exactly is India's position on the freedom of navigation operations? And what exactly is the US Navy's view on the freedom of navigation and operations? Because clearly this is going to increase in the Indian Ocean and elsewhere.
And finally, Shashwat asks about how prominent is Afghanistan in the context of U.S.-India relations? And obviously, this is an issue that you're very familiar with, indeed.
Yeah, thanks, Ashwin. Look, it is prominent. It's part and parcel of the conversation. Zalmay Khalilzad has been a central figure in the diplomatic kind of parley between India and the US and Afghanistan for a very long time now. I mean, he comes to India, he meets with people, meets with the foreign minister, and then, of course, in classic Zalmay Khalilzad style, or what seems to be classic style, he tweets about it. But so Afghanistan is central to India's concerns. I mean, the fact is, if there is a full withdrawal of American troops, which I think in the next 1 year will be highly probable, or if not sooner, the after effects are going to be felt by bordering countries and by countries in the region, like India. And that's just a fact. So I think both countries today cooperate a lot more in Afghanistan than they did back between roughly 2001 and 2012, right? I think it's really since 2012-13 that both countries have come to some understanding when it comes to the role of the Taliban, etc. But look, the fact is, it's as simple as this. No matter how cooperative the India-US relationship is, if you've got a large faction of the Taliban, whoever the Taliban is, you could say that these are the more genteel Taliban or the good Taliban or the better Taliban sitting in Doha or Dubai or wherever. If you've got a big chunk of this Taliban sitting in the parliament, a parliament, by the way, that India built, shaping Afghan politics well into the future, and a Taliban that out of coercion, perhaps rather than choice, is shaped by the state of Pakistan and the ISI, right? And that's just a structural fact that's not going away. It is a big problem for India, right? And it's a big problem for those who India has supported historically in Afghanistan. It's a big problem for Indian investments in Afghanistan. And frankly, the stability of the region. On the other hand, what do? Right? You can't win this war, right? Taliban can't win it. The Americans can't win it. ISAF certainly can't win it. So you need some kind of a compact. So, and I think that's the realization that's come home today to say is that it's not good enough to say we don't like it. Question is, we can't do anything about it, right? So now we have to make our best and live with the strategic reality into the future, which makes it slightly easier for the US-India to cooperate on these kind of tricky issues.
Rudra, am I correct in saying that you produced a report on the Taliban not too long ago?
Yeah, it's a Carnegie report. It's called Dealing with the Taliban, where we make a very big argument to say is that, look, you got to deal with the strategic reality on the ground as it is. Number one, deal with the Taliban, speak to the Taliban. Number two, appoint a special envoy to, when it comes to Afghanistan. There's just way too much to do diplomatically when it comes to the Taliban in Afghanistan. And that an embassy or a mission in Kabul cannot do all those things. You need a special envoy, you need a secretariat, or not a secretariat, but you need some kind of a support mechanism. And it makes a big claim to say is you just have to keep supporting the Afghan National Army, which is your best bet for stability, and continue to provide development assistance, even if you don't think that the development assistance can bear fruit over the next decade. That's almost not the point. But you have to keep putting money and keep putting finances to convince the Afghan population and the army that it's still worth it.
As it's now just after 7 p.m., I'm afraid I will need to bring this session to a close. Rudra, thank you so much for a superb presentation, which I found extremely useful and informative, especially in terms of providing a very broad overview, very historic overview of the wide range of issues, opportunities, challenges, and other relevant contexts that constitutes the US-India relationship, especially as we try to look ahead and understand how things are likely to develop in the aftermath of Trump and with the new administration. So, Rudra, thank you very much indeed.
Jeff, thanks a lot, and thanks for your patience. And I hope I didn't bore your students too much. And if your students have any further questions, please feel free to send me an email. And I look forward to being in touch. And Jeff, and I look forward to being in touch with you more, Jeff. Thanks.
Rudra, thank you so much, and especially for that offer for anybody who's listening. Although don't abuse the privilege, I would just beg of you not to abuse the privilege. Before leaving, I would just like to remind everyone that the seminar will resume in 2 weeks on the 26th of April, to be precise, with Professor Giles Scott Smith speaking on the topic of U.S. cultural diplomacy. So I wish all of you a pleasant remainder of the evening, and I think for Rudra, I think it's, what, 10:30 there, so good night. And
Thanks,
look forward to
everyone.
seeing you.
Good night.
Look, seeing you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.